Morning, everyone. We are now up to Perek Ches, Mishna Gimel. Okay, a quick introduction. Once produce has gone through two stages, at that point, the obligation for separating Trumas and Maasros sets in. And at that point of time, you may not eat from that produce at all. Before that time, you're permitted to, so to speak, snack on. It's called achilas aroi, an informal eating, like a snack, that you may do, but you may not eat achilas kava, a formal eating, like what would be seen as a meal. So the two stages before the obligation or the full-fledged obligation sets in, is that its processing is completed. And for different things, the process completion is different. For grain, we mentioned. For wheat, we mentioned it's after it's piled up and the top of it is smoothed over. That's called the processing is complete. But then there's another stage. That stage is that it's brought into your house in a regular fashion. You bring it into your house the regular way it's brought into your house. That is now what creates or puts upon this produce a full obligation of separating Trumas and Maasros. At that point, it's tevel. At that point, you may not eat from it, even a snack, even an informal way of eating. Grapes are typically used, in recent times in the Mishna, grapes were used for producing wine. And therefore, picking a cluster of grapes to eat them is considered that it's not yet completely processed. Now, as we mentioned, the obligation sets in when it's brought into your house. There are other things that could also bring the obligation of separating Trumas and Maasros upon the grain, even without bringing it into your house. And the two examples that we're going to have in our Mishnah is if you bring it into your courtyard, not directly into the house, but into the courtyard. A courtyard would be also considered like bringing it into your house to create the full-fledged obligation of separating Trumas and Maasros. And another situation, we'll call it, that does that makes it considered as he brought into your house is Shabbos. Is when the grain comes into Shabbos, it also is considered that it is like brought into your house, and the obligation for Trumas and Maasros sets in. Okay, so with this introduction, let's begin the Mishnah. A person was eating a cluster of grapes. That means he went by his vineyard, his garden where we had a vine growing, and he picked off some grapes. As we said before, grapes are typically used for pressing wine. So the fact that you are taking these grapes to eat them, although you're deciding to eat them right now, they're still considered not completely processed. They're still considered unprocessed. So you're eating this cluster of grapes, and you went from the garden where the grapes were growing into the courtyard. When you started eating this cluster in the garden, you're now entering the courtyard, and you're planning on continuing eating. Now, this courtyard has the ability to bring an obligation for a truma and maasros on it. So now the question is, by bringing this cluster of grapes into the courtyard, does it now actually create, or does it now make the obligation for Trumas and Maasros to separate set in to the point that you can't eat it anymore? What happens now when you enter this garden, this courtyard that has the ability to create an obligation Trumas and Maasros upon produce that's brought into it? Is that going to happen now with these grapes or not? Rabbi Eliezer says, Yigmar, you can finish eating the grapes. Yeshua Omer lo Yigmar. Yeshua says you cannot finish eating the grapes. So obviously, Rabbi Eliezer is saying, if I can finish eating, that it's not considered that the courtyard, the chutz of the courtyard, brought the obligation of Trumas and Maasros on these grapes. I mean, after all, they're not processed. And if they're not completely, they're still not processed. And therefore, coming in the courtyard itself wouldn't be enough to create the obligation for Trumas and Maasros on it. Yeshua, on the other hand, says you cannot complete, which means, according to him, although seemingly these grapes are unprocessed, still the chutzner, the courtyard, has the ability to bring the obligation of separating trumas and maasros on it, and therefore you cannot finish it. So one way to understand Rabbi Yeshua is to say that Rabbi Yeshua says, even if it's not processed, the chutzner, the courtyard, can still bring the obligation of some maasros, make it set in on these grapes. Others learn that being that you decided to eat these grapes, so they are considered processed. You have no plans of turning these grapes into wine. You're planning on eating them. And therefore, according to Yeshua, we actually have both. We have the completion of the processing plus bringing into the chutzner. If you look at it like that, it's very simple why we say that that it be cut, that you can't eat from it anymore, that there's now an obligation to separate trumas and maasros from it. Because you've got both stages. You've got a completion of the process and you brought it into the chutzner, which is like bringing it into your house. But others learn that it's still considered unprocessed. Nonetheless, Rabbi Yeshua still says the chutzner has the ability to create the obligation of some maasros on these grapes, and therefore you cannot finish them. What's very important to note is that when Rebbe Lezer says you can finish them, there's a caveat. There's a caveat to that, and that is that actually, if you want to finish eating these grapes, you can't finish it in the chutzner. You cannot finish it in the courtyard that you brought it into. You have to take it out. So bringing it into the courtyard does not create the obligation for trumas and maasros on the rest of these grapes, but you can't eat it in the courtyard. You have to go outside of the courtyard, and then you can complete it. Then you can finish it. According to Yeshua, that doesn't help. According to Yeshua, you walk to the courtyard, it creates the obligation. Walking out's not going to help you. But according to Lezer, walking out of the courtyard does help you. But now the question is, how do we understand this? If at the end of the day, bringing it into the chutzner does not create an absolute obligation of separating trumas and maasros here, so then what's the problem eating it inside the courtyard? I'm sorry, what's the problem being inside the courtyard? Why does Rebbe Lezer say, he doesn't say to the Mishna, but this is what the Bartanur brings down. Why does Rebbe Lezer say that you have to finish, you can only finish it outside the courtyard? So an explanation that's given is, and I'll read it to you here from the Yad Avram, since a courtyard is more private than a garden, eating inside the courtyard is considered somewhat formal. Thus, what elsewhere might be considered a snack is considered a meal if it takes place in the courtyard. So as we said before, when produce is unprocessed, you can snack on it. You can't sit down and have a regular meal from it. You can snack on it. It's called achilas haroy, an informal eating. But achilas kava, a more formal way of eating that you may not do. So the explanation here is that eating in a courtyard is already somewhat formal. A garden is considered eating in a garden. People eat that's an informal eating. In a courtyard, that already is considered formal. Let's say it's formal enough. And since it's a formal form of eating, that's considered like a meal eating, and therefore you can't do that. So it's not that the courtyard has not created any absolute obligation on the trumas and maasros for separation, and therefore it's possible to be able to continue eating them without separating trumas and maasros. But since you could only eat an achilas haroy in formal eating, you can't eat the grapes in the chutzner, in the courtyard, because that would be considered a formal eating. And therefore, Rebbe Lezer says you got to walk out and then you can finish it. Yeshua says you can't finish it at all because bringing it into the chutzner has created an absolute obligation for separating trumas and maasros. Next case, chashei chalei Shabbos. So we start with the same case. The person is in his garden. He picks off a cluster of grapes. He starts eating them. He doesn't walk into the courtyard. But this happened close to Shabbos. And now in the middle of eating the cluster of the grapes, it becomes Shabbos. It gets dark. It becomes Shabbos. And as we said before, Shabbos has the ability, just like bringing into a chutzner can bring about an absolute obligation of separating trumas and maasros. Shabbos does the same thing. So this is what we have here. So now, what happens in this case? Chashei chalei Shabbos. Friday night, the night of Shabbos became dark. It became Shabbos. So can you finish eating or not? So Rabbi Yeshua says Yigmar. Yeshua says you can finish. Belezer says he can't finish. So according to Belezer, he says that Shabbos brings an absolute obligation of Chumas and Maasros, therefore you can't finish it. Yeshua says you can finish it. It doesn't bring an absolute obligation of separating Chumas and Maasros on it, so you can finish it. Nonetheless, the Bartenura points out again, the opinion that says you can finish it says there's a caveat to that. And the caveat to that is, excuse me, that even according to Yeshua, you can finish it after Shabbos, not on Shabbos. On Shabbos, you cannot finish it. You can hold on to it until after Shabbos. After Shabbos, you can eat. You don't have to separate Chumas and Maasros from it, but you can't do it on Shabbos. And the explanation given here is the same thing, that by definition, what you eat on Shabbos is more formal. It's not casual. It's considered, it's Shabbos, and you're doing it in honor of Shabbos. And in honor of Shabbos, it's considered something more significant, something more formal. And therefore, again, a formal form of eating you may not do on this unprocessed produce. And therefore, on Shabbos, you cannot do it, but you would be able to do it after Shabbos. What's interesting to note, I just want to make this point, is that in the first case of the Mishna by the chutzah, by the courtyard, there's Rebbe Elazar who said you can finish it, and Yeshua said you can't finish it. And in the case of Shabbos, it's Rebbe Yeshua. The opinions, are, at least in our version of the Mishnah, the opinions are flipped. Rebbe Yeshua is the one who says you can finish it, and Rebbe Elazar is the one who says you can't finish it. I'm not going to go into discussion about that, what the difference is, but just wanted to point that out in case you are very observant and you notice the opinion switched. The opinions did switch, and in the discussion in the commentaries, how to understand that. The next mitzvah we're going to discuss, the mitzvah slaisase, a prohibition, that to destroy any holy object, and not to erase any name from the holy names of Hashem. Shenamar, as the pasuk states, you shall not do so to Hashem your God. The context of the psukim are that when you enter Eretz Yisrael and you come to the places where the Canaanites worshipped idols, where they performed their pagan worship, so you're supposed to destroy, the Torah obligates us to destroy their idols, destroy their altars. And then the pasuk says, but do not do so to Hashem your God. So therefore, it's from there that we learn that that destruction of you cannot do any kind of a destructive act against God. V'heim shiva shema shenim mechakim. So the first example that he discusses is erasing Hashem's name. And this refers to there are 7 names of Hashem that cannot be erased. I do not recall them all offhand, but understandably, we're talking about the name spelled Yud and Hey, Vav and Hey. We're talking about the name Elohim, which is really pronounced with a Hey. We're talking about the name Adoshem, Adnei, that name. Savakos, Sadi, Vav, I, Aleph, Vav, Saf. Those are 4 of the names that you cannot erase them. If you erase them, if you erase even one letter from the name, which basically you've now destroyed the name, you get lashes for that. Again, with warning and witnesses. Now, one who erases an added letter that's used as a suffix, the Elokecha, right? You have the word Elokecha, your God. So that last letter, the Chav Sofis, the Elokecha, which represents your God. So the first letters are the name of Hashem, and the letter at the end, the Chav Sofis, the end Chav, is a suffix that means yours. So what if a person erases that suffix? Or Chem Delokeichem, or your God in the plural form, which would be Chaf Met, Chaf with a Mem Sofis, with an ending Mem. So again, Elokei is the name Elokim. Chem is the suffix that means yours. So if you erase those suffixes, Makin Oise Makas Mardis, that does not carry a Torah penalty, that carries a rabbinic penalty of lashes for being rebellious. Kli Shakasav Alav Shem. You have this vessel, and the name of God is written on it. Kaitzis Lamakim Hashem, cut off the place that has the name of Hashem on it. V'gaines, and put it what we call into shemus, either bury it. You have to hide it. You can't leave it around like that. That's something that's the name of Hashem can get ruined that way. So you got to cut it off and bury it. Vim kasam shem al matachos. Let's say you wrote a name on metal. V'hitech hasam matachos, and you melted the metal. Like you get lashes for that. That's called destroying Hashem's name. That's the equivalent of erasing Hashem's name. Kisvei HaKodesh Perishayim, Holy Scriptures and their commentaries. One of the 5 books of the Chumash, Mishna, Talmud, the Holy Scriptures and their commentaries, which is what Mishna Talmud is. Sheksava and Yisrael b'kedusha. If a Jew wrote them with sanctity, that means he wrote them understanding that with the intent of writing a holy object like a Sefer Torah. Hama'abdan. So when we talk about Holy Scriptures and their commentaries, that means Holy Scriptures means like a Sefer Torah written on a scroll, and the commentaries means everything else, all other Torah works. Shekseven Yisrael b'kedusha, Jew wrote them with holiness. Hama'abdan, one who destroys them. Makin oisei makas mardus. That person again does not receive Torah lashes, but rabbinic lashes for being rebellious. The imksavan apikaris, but if a heretic, meaning a non-believer, a Jew who doesn't believe in the primary principles of the Torah, if he wrote it, he's going to make a living. So he writes a Sefer Torah, tries to pass it on as a kosher one. Sarfin oisan maskara shabahen. You burn it with the names of God that are written in it. For us, listar la'abed shum dvar kedusha. One is forbidden to destroy or ruin any holy object, like tefillin. Tefillin that has in it the parchment with the name of Hashem on it. The boxes, as referred to them, the bottom of the boxes, they are considered holy. They are holy objects, and it's forbidden to destroy them. This applies in all places at all times, both by men and by women. Have a wonderful day.